Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that humanity should have asked more often. What's the worst that could happen? Turns out, when the answer involves methamphetamine, it's pretty much everything. A drug so confident in solving your problems that it created entirely new ones you didn't know were possible. This is the story of a chemical compound that convinced Nazi Germany it could conquer Europe, persuaded American housewives they could achieve domestic perfection, and somehow ended up being cooked in trailer parks across rural America. Same drug, different costumes, equally catastrophic results. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these slow, absurd tales. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're lying right now, perhaps tucked under a blanket halfway between curiosity and sleep. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before we dive into the chaos, let's talk about what methamphetamine actually is, because understanding the monster helps explain why everyone kept inviting it to parties. At its core, meth is a stimulant, the chemical equivalent of someone screaming, "You're fine, keep going," directly into your brain's ear until your central nervous system believes that sleep, food, and basic survival instincts are just suggestions from a very pessimistic friend. It's amphetamine's angrier, more intense cousin. The one who shows up to Thanksgiving dinner vibrating with energy, has 17 ideas about reorganizing your kitchen, and will absolutely fight anyone who suggests maybe it's time to calm down. Chemically, it's just one extra methyl group attached to amphetamine, one tiny molecular change. Like the difference between a golden retriever and a wolf, technically the same family, wildly different at the level where it matters, like whether it will lick your face or eat it. That extra methyl group is doing some serious work though. It helps the compound cross the blood-brain barrier faster and more efficiently, which sounds impressive until you realise faster brain penetration for a stimulant is like bragging that your car can hit a wall at higher speeds. Technically true, missing the larger point about consequences. Our story begins in 1893 Japan, in a laboratory where a chemist named Nagai Nagayoshi was doing what chemists do best. Looking at perfectly functional compounds and asking, but what if we changed it? He was working with ephedrine, derived from the ephedra plant that had been used in traditional Chinese medicine for literally thousands of years. Ephedrine was useful for respiratory issues, reliable, relatively safe, boring. The pharmaceutical equivalent of a Toyota Camry. Nagai took one look at this dependable compound and thought, what if we made it exciting? Which is the exact thinking that has launched every pharmaceutical disaster in history. It's like looking at a regular fire and thinking, this needs gasoline. Technically not wrong if your goal is bigger fire, but perhaps missing some key considerations about control and safety. He synthesized methamphetamine through a reduction process, carefully documenting his work, creating a new compound, probably feeling quite pleased with his chemistry skills. It was a quiet moment, just a scientist doing science, taking notes, publishing findings. The kind of thing that should have been a minor footnote in pharmaceutical journals, mentioned briefly in textbooks, forgotten by everyone except chemistry students cramming for exams. Instead, it was more like planting a tiny seed that would eventually grow into a massive, aggressive, impossible-to-kill tree that would spread seeds everywhere and ruin multiple generations of lives across several continents. But in 1893, it was just an interesting molecule sitting in a flask, waiting for humans to figure out increasingly terrible things to do with it. For a while, nothing much happened. Methamphetamine sat in scientific literature, like an unused gift card everyone forgot about. Other chemists would reference Nagai's work in papers. Oh yes, Nagai synthesized that in 93, interesting compound. But nobody had figured out what to actually do with it. It was a solution waiting for someone to invent a problem it could solve. which is backwards from how useful inventions typically work. Then in 1919, another Japanese chemist named Akira Ogata looked at Nagai's work and thought, "I can make this more efficient." He streamlined the synthesis, figured out how to crystallize it into more stable form, basically wrote the recipe that would eventually circle the globe like the world's worst chain letter. Ogata probably thought he was just doing good chemistry work, maybe publishing a solid paper, perhaps impressing his colleagues. What he'd actually done was create a detailed how-to guide for making one of the most destructive drugs in human history. His lab notes were basically an instruction manual titled "How to Accidentally Devastate Communities, a Chemistry Approach." But he filed them away, published his findings, and went on with his life, blissfully unaware that he'd just made it significantly easier for future humans to make terrible decisions. Even after Ogata's improvements, methamphetamine remained mostly a chemical curiosity through the 1920s. Scientists knew about it. It existed. But nobody had found a compelling reason to manufacture it in quantity. It was like having an extremely powerful tool sitting in a drawer with no clear idea what to build with it, or whether building anything with it was even a good idea. The compound just sat there, patiently waiting for someone to have a spectacularly bad idea. And then the 1930s arrived, wearing efficiency like a religion and bringing with them the kind of confidence that comes right before catastrophic mistakes. Germany in the 1930s was a nation absolutely obsessed with optimization, productivity, and pushing human performance past any reasonable limit. The cultural mood was somewhere between "we can accomplish anything through sheer force of will," and "sleep is for the weak, and we will scientifically eliminate weakness." Everything was about efficiency. Factory output, military readiness, even domestic life was supposed to be optimized like a well-oiled machine. It was the absolute perfect environment for a drug that promised superhuman productivity without apparent downsides, which is exactly what methamphetamine looked like to people who weren't asking enough of the right questions. Enter Temla Pharmaceuticals, a German company that looked at methamphetamine and saw not potentially catastrophic stimulant but miracle of modern chemistry. In 1938, they released it to the market under the name Pervitin, which sounds cheerful and vaguely health-related, like something your grandmother would take for pep, not something that would eventually contribute to the collapse of an empire and the suffering of millions. The name itself is brilliant marketing. It doesn't sound threatening. Pervitin, it practically bounces off the tongue. It sounds like it should come in a cheerful bottle with flowers on the label, not like pharmaceutical-grade speed that will reorganize your brain chemistry in ways you'll regret. The marketing was spectacularly, almost beautifully innocent in ways that make you physically wince when you know how the story ends. Pervitin was advertised as a treatment for depression, fatigue, lack of motivation, general dissatisfaction with reality, probably also sadness about Mondays and disappointment about existence. The suggested uses were comically broad, like they were trying to see how many problems one drug could theoretically solve. Feeling tired? Pervitin will fix that. Feeling sad? Pervitin. Not working hard enough to meet society's impossible expectations? Definitely Pervitin. Experiencing normal human limitations and finding them inconvenient? Boy, oh boy, have we got a chemical solution for you. The advertisements from this era are genuinely fascinating historical artifacts in the way that car crashes are fascinating. You can't look away, you're witnessing something terrible, and you're glad you're not involved. There were ads showing smiling housewives with perfect hair and dead eyes, energetic factory workers who looked thrilled about 12-hour shifts, students studying late into the night with expressions of joy rather than the appropriate existential dread. One advertisement featured a cheerful cartoon character practically vibrating with enthusiasm, little motion lines radiating from its body like it was achieving liftoff. Another showed a woman effortlessly managing an entire household, while looking impossibly refreshed, as if she'd discovered the secret to having 48 hours in every day. The secret, of course, was meth, but they didn't lead with that in the marketing materials. The visual language was all about conquering human limitations, transcending weakness, becoming the efficient, productive citizen that modern society demanded. Nobody's ad campaign said, "Get addicted to meth and watch your life disintegrate in real time." That would have tested poorly with focus groups. But here's where German pharmaceutical enthusiasm reached truly absurd heights. Temmler didn't just sell Pervitin in pill form, they sold it in chocolates, actual candy bars, methamphetamine-laced chocolate sitting on store shelves next to regular food, marketed under friendly names like Panzer Chocolade, literally tank chocolate. Let that image marinate in your brain for a moment. Methamphetamine, in chocolate form, available for purchase like it was a snack option. The packaging was cheerful, the branding friendly like it was just another confection. Should I have an apple for my afternoon pick-me-up, or perhaps some meth-infused chocolate? Decisions. They also made versions specifically marketed to different groups. Fliegerchokolade for pilots, Hausfrauenschokolade for housewives, targeted meth chocolate marketing. Someone had a meeting where they discussed the branding strategy for getting different demographics to consume methamphetamine in candy form, and apparently nobody in that meeting said, "Is this a good idea?" Or if they did, they were outvoted by people very excited about the profit potential. German housewives bought it to power through domestic labour. Students used it to study all night. Factory workers took it to endure brutal shifts. Performers used it to maintain energy during long shows. Within a year of its release, Pervitin was everywhere. Pharmacies couldn't keep it stocked. Temmler was manufacturing millions of tablets and thousands of chocolate bars. The drug went from laboratory curiosity to cultural phenomenon faster than anyone could properly study long-term effects. Which brings us to the thing that makes this period particularly absurd. Everyone thought this was fine. Not fine with some concerns, but genuinely, enthusiastically fine. Medical professionals prescribed it freely, with the confidence of people who definitely knew what they were doing and weren't just making it up as they went along. Pharmacists recommended it like they were suggesting aspirin. "Oh, you're feeling tired? Have you tried methamphetamine? It's quite popular, very modern, all the efficient people are taking it." There were no alarm bells, no regulatory hand-wringing, no one standing up in medical conferences saying, "Perhaps we should study what happens when we give meth to everyone before we give meth to everyone." The medical establishment looked at mass methamphetamine consumption and thought, "This is probably fine. Science has delivered us a miracle, and questioning miracles is for pessimists." It's the same pattern you see throughout pharmaceutical history. A drug appears to solve immediate problems, everyone gets excited about immediate results, and nobody thinks to ask what happens in 6 months, a year, 5 years, or when people try to stop and discover their baseline energy was a comfortable lie. But civilian Pervitin use, impressive as it was in scale and absurdity, was about to be dwarfed by what happened when the German military got interested. Because while housewives were using meth chocolate to power through laundry, and students were using it to cram for exams, the Wehrmacht was paying very, very close attention. They looked at a drug that eliminated fatigue, suppressed appetite, boosted confidence, and reduced fear response, and they thought, that sounds extremely useful for warfare, which is technically true but misses some important nuances about sustainability, long-term consequences, and whether creating an army dependent on methamphetamine might present strategic vulnerabilities. But those were future problems, and the German military was focused on present solutions. The Wehrmacht began systematic testing of Pervitin in 1939, and they were not remotely subtle about it. This wasn't some covert program hidden in underground bunkers with code names and secrecy. Military doctors conducted official studies, complete with paperwork, documentation, and probably PowerPoint presentations if PowerPoint had existed. They carefully measured how the drug affected soldiers' performance, endurance, aggression, and willingness to charge into situations that sober people would recognize as bad ideas. The results were exactly what you'd expect when you give methamphetamine to young men, and then measure their capacity for sustained activity and reduced self-preservation instinct. Soldiers could march longer distances without complaining about minor issues like exhaustion or physical limitations. They could fight harder and longer. They could stay awake for days, operating on chemical willpower while their bodies quietly screamed for rest that never came. The drug appeared to create the perfect fighting machine. Tireless, fearless, absolutely convinced of their own invincibility, even when all available evidence suggested otherwise. It's like giving someone the confidence of a golden retriever combined with the sleeplessness of a new parent, then handing them weapons and pointing them at enemies. What could possibly go wrong? By 1940, Pervitin had become standard issue for the Wehrmacht. Not optional, not for special operations, not take this if you feel you need it. Standard issue. Like helmets, boots, and rifles, except those items don't create physical dependencies or alter brain chemistry. Soldiers received millions of tablets. The drug was distributed with the same bureaucratic efficiency as ammunition. Somewhere in the German military apparatus there was a quartermaster managing Pervitin supplies like it was inventory for a grocery store. Requisition forms, distribution logs, supply chains, the entire bureaucratic infrastructure of a military running partially on speed. Future historians found these documents and had to process the surreal reality of official paperwork for industrial-scale meth distribution. Ah, yes, here's Form 47B for 3,000 doses of methamphetamine for the 12th Panzer Division. Please sign in triplicate and return by Thursday. Just normal military logistics, nothing to see here. Definitely not creating a systemic drug dependency across an entire armed force. The invasion of France in spring 1940 showcased Pervitin's military application in ways that were genuinely impressive if you ignore all context about consequences. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, wasn't just brilliant tactics and superior technology. It was partially powered by the fact that German soldiers didn't need sleep because they were on meth. Tank crews pushed through the Ardennes forest in a sustained assault that required staying awake and operational for days on end. Traditional military wisdom said this was physically impossible. Humans need rest. They need sleep. They need basic biological downtime, or they start making mistakes that get people killed. Pervitin looked at traditional military wisdom and said, actually, biology is negotiable if you have enough chemicals. Tank commanders were awake for 3, 4, 5 days straight, operating complex machinery that could kill them instantly if they made mistakes, while their brains were chemically convinced that everything was fine and they were at peak performance. Infantry units marched day and night, covering distances that should have required rest stops that never came. Pilots flew extended missions with artificially sharpened reaction times and chemically suppressed fear, which sounds great until you remember that fear exists for excellent reasons, and suppressing it while flying high-speed aircraft in combat might be suboptimal. The drug created a military force operating outside normal human limitations, which seemed like a tactical advantage until those limitations showed up to collect their debt with interest. The speed and ferocity of the Blitzkrieg genuinely shocked Allied forces. They were facing an enemy that didn't seem to need sleep, didn't seem to tire, just kept coming with aggressive confidence. It looked like superior German discipline and training. Partially it was just meth. They were losing to an army on speed, which sounds like a rejected Captain America plot but was actual history. In the short term, the tactical advantage was undeniable. Pervitin-fueled soldiers accomplished things that would be impossible for unmedicated troops. They moved faster, fought longer, overwhelmed offensive positions before those positions could organise. The Wehrmacht looked unstoppable, at least for a while. But, and this is a significant but, what the German military command failed to account for, or chose to ignore, because acknowledging it would require changing their entire operational doctrine, was what happened when the chemical enhancement wore off. Because it always wears off. Physics doesn't care about your military objectives, and biology always collects what it's owed. Soldiers started experiencing the inevitable consequences of sustained methamphetamine use. Extreme fatigue that went beyond normal tiredness into something closer to physical collapse. Paranoia that turned squadmates into potential threats. Anxiety that manifested as inappropriate aggression. Judgment impairment that led to tactical mistakes and friendly fire incidents. And addiction, though the military really didn't like using that word. They called it dependency or habituation or increased tolerance, as if different terminology changed the underlying pharmacological reality. Turns out that when you give soldiers methamphetamine regularly, you create soldiers who need methamphetamine regularly. Shocking development that nobody could have predicted, except literally anyone who thought about it for 30 seconds. Soldiers were requesting more Pervitin, needing more, unable to function without it. The military had accidentally created a fighting force that required continuous chemical enhancement to maintain operational capacity. Your army's effectiveness now depends on pharmaceutical supply chains, which can be disrupted, which means you've introduced a critical vulnerability shaped like a pill. The letters home from soldiers during this period are haunting when you know what you're looking at. They describe insomnia despite exhaustion, racing thoughts, feeling simultaneously tired and unable to rest. They mention needing their medicine and describe withdrawal symptoms without understanding what's happening. "I feel strange when I don't take my tablets," one soldier wrote home. "Everything seems heavier and slower." That's not a vitamin deficiency. That's addiction described by someone who doesn't have the framework to recognise it. He probably thought his body was defective, that he was personally weak, when really his body was responding exactly as bodies respond to sustained stimulant use followed by withdrawal. His body was fine. The situation was insane. By 1941, the military medical corps was noticing patterns that couldn't be ignored even with determined optimism. Reports of soldiers having psychotic breaks in the field. Behavioural problems that went beyond combat stress into something stranger and more concerning. Physical health declining despite adequate rations because, fun fact, you can't actually replace sleep with chemicals indefinitely without your body staging a revolt. Some military doctors began raising concerns, writing careful memos suggesting that perhaps systematic methamphetamine distribution might have downsides worth considering. Their concerns were noted, filed properly in the appropriate bureaucratic channels, and largely ignored, because by this point the military was as dependent on Pervitin as the soldiers taking it. They'd built their operational capacity around chemical enhancement. They designed strategies assuming soldiers could operate without sleep. Stopping meant admitting the entire approach was flawed, and also meant dealing with an army in mass withdrawal, which presented obvious operational challenges. So they kept going, because stopping seemed harder than continuing, which is addict logic applied at institutional scale. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was particularly aggressive with Pervitin distribution, which makes a terrible kind of sense. Flying requires sustained concentration, quick reflexes, complex decision-making under pressure, all while operating machinery that will kill you instantly if you make mistakes. Methamphetamine appeared to enhance these capabilities. In reality, it created pilots who were overconfident, impulsive, making decisions with chemically altered judgment while flying very fast, very high with bombs. The confidence was chemical, not actual competence, but confidence feels the same from the inside, whether it's earned or pharmaceutical. Pilots received Pervitin routinely, especially for long missions or night operations. There are documented cases of Luftwaffe pilots becoming so dependent that they couldn't fly without it. Not because they were bad pilots, many were quite skilled, but because their baseline function had been chemically shifted. They trained and operated so long under the influence that sober flying felt wrong, felt impaired, felt like they were operating at reduced capacity, when really they were just experiencing normal after months of chemical enhancement. The Luftwaffe had accidentally created a situation where combat effectiveness required continuous drug use, which is a phenomenally bad strategic position. Nobody wanted to acknowledge this because saying it out loud sounded insane. Our pilots need meth to fly effectively. That's not great messaging for recruitment or morale, but if we're talking about methamphetamine use in Nazi Germany, we absolutely must discuss the man at the top, because Adolf Hitler's personal pharmaceutical journey was its own special disaster nested inside the larger disaster. Hitler wasn't just leading a military that used meth extensively. He himself was a dedicated consumer of various drugs, including methamphetamine, all administered by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, who represents perhaps the worst possible combination of medical credentials and complete absence of professional judgment. Morell became Hitler's personal doctor in 1936, and over the next 9 years he essentially conducted a long-form experiment in how many drugs can one person take before exploding. He wasn't trying to be evil, though working for Hitler complicated the ethics considerably. He was more like a doctor who'd completely forgotten that his job was healthcare, not pharmaceutical concierge service. Hitler had various ailments, some legitimate, some psychosomatic, all treated by Morell with impressive chemical enthusiasm. Stomach problems, drugs, insomnia, different drugs, fatigue, more drugs, anxiety about the genocidal war you're orchestrating going badly, believe it or not, also drugs. Morell's medical philosophy was essentially better living through chemistry, executed with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer made of pills. The injections were almost daily, sometimes multiple times per day. Morell called them vitamin shots, which is technically true in the way that calling a hurricane weather is technically true. Yes, there were vitamins in the mixture. There were also steroids, testosterone, methamphetamine, and a rotating cast of other substances that definitely should not be combined in a single bloodstream. Hitler received these injections with touching faith that his doctor knew what he was doing. Morell kept meticulous records because he was nothing if not thorough about his pharmaceutical experimentation on the Führer. These records survived the war, and they're genuinely disturbing reading, like a case study in everything you should never do as a physician, except it's real, and it affected world history. By the early 1940s, Hitler was receiving regular injections of Eucadal, which is pharmaceutical-grade oxycodone, high-quality opiates, combined with methamphetamine in the same person. At the same time, let that combination settle in your mind. The person making strategic decisions for Germany's military was on a daily speedball, administered by a doctor whose approach to dosing appeared to be whatever keeps my patient happy and prevents him from firing me or worse. It's like something from dark comedy. Imagine pitching this as fiction. So the dictator running a world war is making strategic decisions while on meth and opiates, given to him by a doctor who's basically just saying yes to everything. Editors would reject it as too unrealistic, too on the nose. But it happened, with consequences measured in millions of lives and the trajectory of human history. The medical records paint a picture of steady physical decline through the 1940s that aligns perfectly with long-term stimulant abuse. Hitler developed tremors, especially in his left hand, clearly visible in later footage if you know what you're looking for. His sleep was chaotic, cycling between insomnia and sudden crashes, mood swings that went beyond normal stress into something more erratic and volatile. His decision-making became increasingly impulsive and divorced from strategic reality. He'd make military decisions that his generals privately thought were insane, but couldn't contradict without risking their careers or lives. Whether the meth caused the bad decisions or just amplified existing terrible judgment is hard to say, but it certainly wasn't helping the situation. Picture the scene. It's 1944, the war is going catastrophically badly, and there's Hitler in his bunker making strategic decisions about troop movements while chemically altered by a cocktail that would make a modern ER doctor weep. His generals are trying to work around orders that make no tactical sense, unable to directly confront the fact that their supreme commander is tweaking. There's something almost darkly comedic about imagining those meetings. Ornate room, military maps spread on tables, serious men in impressive uniforms, and at the head of the table someone who's been injected with meth and opiates deciding the fate of armies. It's tragic farce, except the consequences were devastatingly real. The final months in the Berlin bunker saw Hitler's drug use accelerate even as supplies became scarce. Morel kept administering injections almost until the end, though even he eventually fled when it became clear that staying meant becoming a Soviet prisoner. By April 1945, Hitler looked like what he was. Someone who'd been doing hard drugs for years and whose body had finally had enough. The final photographs and films show a man who looks decades older than his 56 years, moving with tremors, showing all the physical signs of long-term stimulant abuse. When he died by suicide on April 30th, 1945, he left behind many horrifying legacies, including medical records that stunned Allied doctors who examined them after the war. The cocktail of substances Hitler had been receiving daily was genuinely shocking, even to military doctors who'd seen a lot. It raised uncomfortable questions about impairment, decision-making capacity, and the degree to which late-war German strategy had been influenced by a leader operating under serious chemical influence. Not that this excuses anything. Terrible people make terrible decisions sober too, but it adds a layer of pharmaceutical chaos to an already chaotic period. But Hitler's personal drug disaster was almost a sideshow compared to the larger story of Pervitin's systematic military use. By 1941-1942, the problems had become too obvious to ignore even for people with strong incentives to ignore them. Soldiers were having health crises. Units reported discipline problems that went beyond normal military issues. The miracle drug was revealing itself to be exactly what it was, a powerful stimulant with serious side effects and addiction potential that absolutely should not have been given to millions of people without proper consideration of consequences. The military began pulling back on Pervitin distribution in 1941, reclassifying it from general issue to controlled substance. Which sounds responsible until you realise this meant soldiers who'd been taking it regularly for months or years were suddenly facing withdrawal without adequate support or understanding. Imagine you're on the Eastern Front, which is already a frozen hellscape of existential horror, and suddenly the drug you've been depending on to function is unavailable. Your body crashes, your mind goes foggy, you feel like death, and you're still expected to fight. It's adding a medical crisis to a military crisis, which is suboptimal military strategy. Some soldiers hoarded Pervitin when they could get it. Others sought it through unofficial channels, creating black markets within the military. Medics faced pressure to distribute tablets they were supposed to restrict. The attempted crackdown created the same dynamics as any drug prohibition after widespread dependency. Demand doesn't disappear just because supply is officially cut off. The civilian population faced similar chaos. Pervitin remained in pharmacies longer than in military supply, but restrictions were tightening. Doctors who'd been casually prescribing it for years were suddenly told to limit prescriptions. Patients who'd been using it regularly found themselves cut off. There's dark comedy in imagining the German home front in 1943-1944, a civilian population dealing with rationing, bombing raids and war stress while also collectively withdrawing from methamphetamine. The exhaustion, irritability and difficulty concentrating were symptoms of both war fatigue and stimulant withdrawal, compounding each other in ways nobody was equipped to handle. The government had accidentally addicted portions of its population and was now managing the fallout while fighting a losing war on multiple fronts. They'd literally drugged themselves into a corner. By 1945, as Germany collapsed, the Pervitin story collapsed with it. Temmler's factories were destroyed or captured. Supply chains broke down. Systematic distribution became impossible. Soldiers and civilians went through withdrawal amid military defeat and occupation. A population-level health crisis layered on top of everything else. Allied forces entering Germany discovered the extent of Pervitin use with genuine shock. They found massive stockpiles in military depots. Pharmacies still stocked it. Soldiers carried tablets in personal effects. Medical officers examining captured troops noted symptoms consistent with stimulant addiction. Weight loss, dental problems, psychological disturbances beyond normal combat stress. Americans were particularly fascinated by how systematic the distribution had been. They collected Pervitin tablets, studied German military records, tried to understand how an entire nation had ended up on meth, while apparently thinking it was fine. The post-war reckoning took years. In the immediate chaos of 1945, Germany's mass drug problem was one crisis among many. But as occupation authorities rebuilt society, the pharmaceutical aftermath became unavoidable. Doctors reported patients desperately seeking prescriptions no longer available. There were withdrawal clinics, though calling them that required acknowledging the problem's scope, so they used vague language about nervous exhaustion and recovery facilities. The medical establishment had to quietly handle the consequences of prescribing methamphetamine for everything from mild sadness to normal tiredness. The story should end here, right? Germany's cautionary tale is a clear warning about systematic drug use. The evidence was overwhelming. Methamphetamine provided short-term benefits and long-term disasters. Addiction, health decline, impaired judgment, military collapse, all thoroughly documented. Any rational observer would conclude that widespread methamphetamine use was a spectacularly terrible idea that should never be repeated. The data was clear. The outcomes were undeniable. The lesson was written in medical records and historical consequences. But here's the thing about human rationality and pharmaceutical enthusiasm. They have a complicated relationship, like former friends who stop talking after an incident nobody discusses at parties. Because even as Germany dealt with Pervitin's aftermath, other countries were watching with interest. And the lesson some took wasn't, don't use methamphetamine. It was, perhaps we could use methamphetamine better. The US military had been studying German Pervitin use since capturing intelligence reports. American military doctors examined the data with professional interest and optimistic interpretation. They saw performance enhancements, extended operational capacity, tactical advantages. They noted addiction and health problems, hard to miss, but sensed these might be implementation issues rather than fundamental flaws. Maybe with better dosing, better medical oversight, better controls, methamphetamine could be made safe and useful. Maybe the Germans just did it wrong. Maybe American medicine and American exceptionalism could succeed where German efficiency failed. This is the thinking that creates historical cycles. The belief that we'll do it better despite overwhelming evidence. The fundamental approach is flawed. It's like watching someone drive off a cliff and thinking, I bet I could make that jump with more speed. American pharmaceutical companies were already manufacturing amphetamines. Benzodrine had existed since the 1930s. Methamphetamine was just one methyl group away. And there was a potential market, military and civilian, that was enormous and untapped. In the late 1940s, as Europe rebuilt and Cold War tensions rose, the US military quietly researched methamphetamine for troops. Not widespread distribution like the Germans, they'd learned something, but studied controlled application for specific scenarios, long-range missions, special operations requiring extended alertness, the same rationalizations, just with Americans convinced they'd learned from German mistakes. Narrators note, they had not learned from German mistakes. They'd learned they could make the same mistakes with better PR. But military use would be nothing compared to the civilian front. American pharmaceutical companies looked at post-war America and saw opportunity glowing like neon. They saw exhausted populations, women transitioning from factories to domestic roles, students filling, universities on the GI Bill, workers adjusting to peacetime economy. They saw exhaustion, productivity pressure, and impossible expectations everywhere. And they thought, we have a chemical solution for that. Methamphetamine was about to be rebranded and reintroduced to the American public. Same drug that powered the Wehrmacht, same compound Hitler injected daily, same chemical that contributed to Germany's collapse. Now with friendly American branding, medical legitimacy and pharmaceutical company backing, who'd looked at Germany's disaster and seen a business opportunity. It would be sold as digoxin, methedrin and obitrol, prescribed by trusted doctors, purchased at neighborhood pharmacies, consumed by millions of Americans told it was safe, effective, and appropriate for everything from weight loss to depression to fatigue. Germany's Pervitin experience should have been an unmissable cautionary tale, preventing other countries from making identical mistakes. A clear example of what not to do, written in millions of people suffering and a military machine's collapse. Instead, it became a case study other nations thought they could improve upon, because humanity's relationship with pharmaceutical shortcuts is like humanity's relationship with all shortcuts. We know they usually end badly, but this time will surely be different. The pharmaceutical industry looked at Germany's mass addiction and saw market opportunity with minor implementation issues. They had a drug people wanted that solved immediate problems, that could be marketed to desperate populations seeking easy solutions to complex challenges. Methamphetamine's story didn't end with Nazi Germany's collapse. That was just Act 1. The drug had proven effective at certain things, keeping people awake, suppressing appetite, creating feelings of capability that seemed real, even when they were chemical illusions. Those effects didn't change based on borders or political systems. What changed was packaging, marketing, and medical establishment willingness to prescribe while maintaining this time would be different. By 1950, methamphetamine would flow through American pharmacies with FDA approval and medical blessing. Doctors would prescribe it with the same confidence German doctors showed in 1938. Patients would trust their physicians, believing American medicine had learned from European mistakes, that proper supervision would prevent Germany's problems. It would not be different. Drug effects don't change based on consumer nationality or oversight quality. Methamphetamine creates dependency, whether distributed by Wehrmacht quartermasters or American physicians. Addiction mechanisms don't care about good intentions or medical degrees. But that lesson would take decades to learn, or more accurately, to finally accept after repeatedly ignoring screaming evidence. The stage was set. Germany had provided proof of concept, documented problems, and collapsed under pharmaceutical enthusiasm. Their experience was written in medical records, military documents, and devastation of millions. And America was about to pick up where Germany left off, convinced American exceptionalism extended to drug metabolism, that better intentions would produce better outcomes, that this time the story would end differently. Spoiler, it would not end differently. The drug would do what drugs do because chemistry doesn't care about national pride or marketing budgets. But that's the next chapter. For now, let's sit with the fact that humanity looked at a clear example of what not to do, decided the real lesson was we should do that with better branding, then spent decades being shocked when things went exactly as wrong as they obviously would. Humans are phenomenally bad at learning from others' mistakes, turns out. We prefer making them ourselves, ideally while convinced we're being clever, and definitely won't repeat history because we're special. So Germany collapsed, the world surveyed the wreckage, and everyone agreed that systematic methamphetamine distribution had been, let's say, suboptimal. Lesson learned, right? Humanity would never make that mistake again. Except America looked at the pile of pervitin evidence and thought, but what if we tried it with better marketing? The 1950s arrived wearing pearls and paranoia in equal measure. The war was over, prosperity was mandatory, and everyone was expected to be grateful, productive, and exhausted in the most cheerful way possible. Picture a nation of people trying very hard to pretend that transitioning from total war to suburban paradise wasn't absolutely draining. Soldiers who'd seen unspeakable things were now expected to mow lawns with enthusiasm. Women who'd built bombers were suddenly supposed to find profound meaning in arranging throw pillows. The cultural mood was somewhere between "we're living the dream" and "why does living the dream require so much energy?" Enter American pharmaceutical companies, who'd been watching the German pervitin situation with the kind of interest usually reserved for competitors' product launches. They saw the addiction, the health problems, the societal chaos and thought, interesting concept, flawed execution. The drug worked after all. It just needed American rebranding. Less Wehrmacht stimulant, more helpful little pick-me-up for modern living. Methamphetamine arrived at American pharmacies dressed in respectable names. Disoxin, from Abbott Laboratories, which sounds less like meth and more like a cleaning product your grandmother would trust. Methedrin, from Burroughs Wellcome, practically medical sounding. And Obertrol, which sounds like it should come with a tiny cape. Same chemical that powered the Blitzkrieg, now available at your neighbourhood pharmacy, prescribed by the friendly family doctor who delivered your children. The marketing materials are genuinely fascinating, by which I mean their psychological horror, disguised as helpful medical information. Pharmaceutical ads in 1950s medical journals showed images of smiling housewives, energetic students and productive workers, all thanks to the miracle of sympathomimetic amines, which is fancy medical terminology for speed. But we're not calling it that because branding matters. One advertisement, and this is real, showed a housewife in a pristine kitchen, beaming at her sparkling countertops, with text suggesting that modern medicine could help with the tiredness that comes from managing a busy household. Another featured a student surrounded by books, looking alert and confident, because why would you address systemic academic pressure when you could just prescribe stimulants? The FDA, bless them, approved these medications with the kind of optimism that seems reckless in hindsight, but was apparently standard practice at the time. The approval process asked important questions like, does it appear to work, and does it immediately kill people? If the answers were yes and no respectively, congratulations, you've got yourself an approved medication. Long-term effects were future medicine's problem. Doctors began prescribing methamphetamine for an absolutely stunning variety of conditions. Depression, meth. Fatigue, meth. Obesity, definitely meth. Lack of motivation, meth. Feeling vaguely sad about the state of modern existence. Have you considered meth? The medical approach was essentially, let's see what happens, executed with prescription pads and confidence. And what happened, predictably, is that a whole lot of Americans ended up on methamphetamine while thinking they were just taking medicine. Which is technically true in the way that vodka is technically a beverage. The weight loss market was particularly, let's say, enthusiastic. Post-war American culture had decided that women should be impossibly thin, while also managing households, raising children, and maintaining perpetual cheerfulness. These expectations were contradictory and exhausting, which created the perfect problem for pharmaceutical solutions. Methamphetamine suppresses appetite quite effectively. It also suppresses sleep, rational thinking, and eventually most higher brain functions. But the appetite suppression was the selling point. A woman could visit her doctor, mention wanting to lose weight, and leave with a prescription for disoxin. No lectures about diet. No exploration of why beauty standards might be problematic. Just take one pill in the morning, maybe another at lunch, and watch your appetite disappear. Which it did, along with her ability to sleep, her emotional stability, and several years of her life. But at least she'd fit into smaller dresses. The genius of this was the medical framing. This wasn't vanity. This was healthcare. Your doctor prescribed it, which made it medicine, which made taking it responsible health management, rather than, doing meth. The pharmaceutical companies understood this psychology perfectly. Their advertisements always featured medical authority. Doctors, nurses, clinical settings. Never get high and lose weight. Always, medical science has a solution for your completely normal body, failing to meet arbitrary cultural standards. What the ads didn't show were the women lying awake at 3 a.m, heart racing like a hummingbird's, wondering why they felt simultaneously exhausted and unable to rest. They didn't mention the irritability, the paranoia, or the way stopping the pills made you feel like you'd been hit by a truck made of exhaustion. They definitely didn't explain that you weren't actually losing weight permanently. You were just chemically overriding your appetite, and the moment you stopped, your body would exact revenge. But weight loss was just the opening act. The real market was exhaustion, and America had exhaustion in abundance. The housewife story is particularly dark when you look at it closely. Post-war domestic. Life was sold as paradise, but functioned as isolating, repetitive labour, with no days off and no acknowledgement that it was even work. Women were supposed to find fulfillment in cleaning the same house repeatedly, cooking 3 meals daily, managing children's lives, and doing all of it with magazine cover appearance and attitude. If you felt tired, frustrated, or like your brain was slowly dying from understimulation, clearly you had a personal failing requiring medical intervention. Doctors prescribed amphetamines for housewife syndrome, which wasn't a real medical condition. It was a rational response to unreasonable circumstances. But treating circumstances would require social change. Prescribing pills was easy and profitable, so women got prescriptions for disoxin or dexedrine, told to take them to help with energy and mood, and sent home to their isolating domestic situations now with chemical assistance. Picture suburban neighbourhoods in 1958. Multiple women on the same street, all taking prescribed amphetamines, all functioning on chemical energy. None of them discussing it because medication was private. They'd smile at each other over grocery carts, exchange pleasantries about children and recipes, both running on meth, both wondering privately why they felt anxious and strange, neither one mentioning it because that would be admitting imperfection. The drug worked, in a sense. It did provide energy. Women could push through exhaustion, accomplish more tasks, maintain the appearance of effortless domestic perfection. The problem, and this seems obvious in retrospect, is that the exhaustion was trying to tell them something. It was their body's way of saying, these expectations are unsustainable. Methamphetamine just turned off that warning system, while the underlying problem got worse. The tolerance issue was particularly cruel. Women would start with one pill, but after a few weeks, that stopped working as effectively, so they'd take 2, then 3. The doctor would authorize higher doses because clearly the patient still needed help. Nobody called it addiction because addiction happened to people with moral failings, not to respectable housewives taking prescribed medication from legitimate doctors. There were women managing their entire lives on amphetamines for years, their baseline energy so chemically shifted that being sober felt like being broken. Some realized what was happening and tried to quit, experiencing withdrawal that was genuinely hellish. Others never quite made the connection, just kept taking the pills because life was impossible without them, never quite asking why life had become impossible. Meanwhile, students were discovering that the same drugs worked great for academic pressure, which is how you end up with medical students learning about the dangers of drug abuse, while personally taking methamphetamine to survive their education. The irony was apparently lost on everyone involved. College campuses in the 1960s were intense environments. Veterans on the GI Bill trying to compress education while supporting families. Traditional students facing increased academic competition. Graduate programs with workloads designed for people who don't require sleep. Amphetamines offered an apparent solution. Chemical study enhancement. Take a pill, study for 12 hours straight, ace the exam, repeat. The pills circulated like contraband candy. Someone had a prescription, they'd share with roommates, who'd share with friends, and suddenly half the pre-med students were running on pharmaceutical assistance. Student health services wrote prescriptions with minimal questions asked because obviously students needed help managing academic demands. It was treated as practical support rather than institutionally enabled drug distribution. Law students took them for case reading marathons. Engineering students used them to power through problem sets that would be impossible for anyone operating on normal human sleep. Even liberal arts students, facing deadlines on papers they'd procrastinated, discovered that amphetamines could help you write 20 pages of literary analysis in one night. Whether that analysis was actually good is a different question, but it existed and was submitted on time. The rationalization was always, just this once, or just until I get through this semester. But academic pressure doesn't conveniently end. There's always another exam, another paper, another semester. And by the time students realized they'd been taking amphetamines regularly for months, they were dependent in ways they hadn't anticipated. Stopping meant facing all the deferred exhaustion plus withdrawal symptoms, which made continuing seem like the only viable option. Some students carried these habits into professional life. The medical resident who survived training on amphetamines sometimes continued as a practicing physician. The lawyer who got through law school on chemical assistance might maintain that habit through brutal associate years. The engineer, the academic, the business professional. Stimulant use that started as desperate student survival strategy became professional productivity tool. Then there were the truck drivers, and this is where things get particularly American in the worst way. The interstate highway system was expanding, creating a national network requiring constant shipping traffic. The American economy ran on trucks, and trucks ran on drivers who could cover impossible distances on absurd schedules. The limiting factor was human biology's annoying insistence on sleep. Bennies, short for Benzedrine, became trucker slang for amphetamine pills. They were as standard as CB radios and considerably more effective than coffee at eliminating sleep's tyranny. A driver could pop a few bennies and drive through the night, covering 800 miles in a shift that would be physically impossible without chemical assistance. The culture around this was remarkably open. Truck stop waitresses knew who was running on speed. They'd pour coffee for drivers who were obviously tweaking, making small talk while both parties understood what was happening. Dispatchers scheduled routes with the implicit understanding that drivers had chemical assistance. It wasn't officially acknowledged, but everyone knew. The American supply chain was partially powered by methamphetamine, and everyone involved just accepted this as occupational normalcy. What made this particularly dangerous, beyond the obvious safety issues of operating large vehicles while on stimulants, was the economic pressure. A driver who insisted on adequate sleep couldn't compete with drivers who didn't need sleep. If you wanted rest and your competitor didn't, they got more routes, more money, more work. The system actively punished sobriety and rewarded drug use. Its exploitation dressed as personal choice, and it worked because the exploitation was so widespread it seemed normal. Drivers who tried to quit found themselves at a competitive disadvantage. Your body insisting on sleep became a professional liability. The choice was between chemical enhancement and unemployment, which isn't really a choice. And so the bennies continued, passed around truck stops, sold openly in some cases, maintained as an open secret that kept America's logistics running. Throughout all of this, the housewives, the students, the truckers, the medical establishment maintained that these were appropriate prescriptions for legitimate conditions. A woman's exhaustion from unreasonable domestic demands was depression. A student's difficulty managing impossible workload was a focus problem. A trucker's inability to drive for days without sleep was a wakefulness issue. In each case, the prescription was the same: stimulants. Nobody wanted to acknowledge that maybe the conditions were the problem. Fixing conditions is complicated, expensive, and requires admitting that systems are broken. Writing prescriptions is quick, easy, and profitable. The pharmaceutical companies were making extraordinary amounts of money. Amphetamine production in the United States reached billions of pills annually by the mid-1960s. Billions. With a B, that's not treating rare medical conditions. That's medicating a significant portion of the population. The advertising continued, cheerful and confident. Pharmaceutical sales representatives visited doctors' offices with samples and persuasive literature. Medical journals carried ads showing the happy, productive lives made possible by modern pharmacology. The message was consistent. These drugs solved problems, and any negative effects were either rare side effects or user error, never fundamental flaws in the approach. By the mid-1960s, some physicians were starting to notice patterns. Patients who'd been on amphetamines for years were developing health problems. Emergency rooms saw stimulant-induced psychosis cases. The evidence was accumulating that maybe, just maybe, giving methamphetamine to millions of people wasn't the miracle solution it had seemed. But here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting, I mean predictably terrible. Around the same time that the medical establishment was slowly realizing they'd been overprescribing stimulants, the counterculture was discovering them from a completely different angle, and their response was immediate and unambiguous. Speed kills. The hippie movement encountered methamphetamine and recognized it as qualitatively different from other drugs they were exploring. This was a movement that was generally pro-drug, that advocated for consciousness expansion through chemicals, and even they looked at speed and said, no, this one's different, this one destroys people. The Haight-Ashbury-free clinics in San Francisco started seeing casualties, young people who'd tried various drugs but found that methamphetamine was uniquely destructive. The The visible deterioration was part of what made speed so obviously dangerous. Someone smoking marijuana might get red eyes and eat too much. Someone on LSD might have weird insights about universal consciousness. But someone using methamphetamine regularly looked sick. The weight loss, the skin problems, the dental decay, the physical manifestation of stimulant abuse was undeniable. Speed users looked like they were being consumed by their drug of choice, because they were. Speed kills became a slogan within a community that was otherwise pro-drug experimentation, which should tell you something about how bad methamphetamine's effects were. The counterculture was willing to take chances on consciousness and chemistry, but speed was recognized as different, not enlightening, just destructive. Meanwhile, biker gangs were also discovering methamphetamine, though their relationship with it was more entrepreneurial. For outlaw motorcycle clubs, speed was functional. It kept you awake, made you aggressive, was relatively cheap to produce. Some clubs began manufacturing and selling meth as a revenue stream, establishing distribution networks that would later expand dramatically. By the late 1960s, you had this fascinating situation where methamphetamine existed in multiple American contexts simultaneously, all somehow treated as separate phenomena. Housewives taking digoxin prescribed by family doctors, students using pharmaceutical amphetamines for studying, truckers popping bennies to make schedules, hippies warning each other away from street speed, bikers manufacturing and distributing. Same drug, wildly different contexts, heading toward the same destination. Addiction and destruction. The medical establishment was slow to connect these threads because they saw prescription amphetamines as fundamentally different from street speed, even though chemically they were often identical. The context seemed to matter more than the substance, which is a comforting belief, but pharmacologically nonsense. The molecule doesn't care who prescribed it or why you're taking it. It does what it does. Congress eventually noticed, which happens when a problem becomes too visible to ignore completely. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 placed amphetamines, including methamphetamine, into Schedule II. Recognized as highly addictive but with accepted medical uses, this meant stricter prescribing requirements, better tracking, more oversight. In theory. In practice, the drug was still available, just with more paperwork. Doctors adapted, becoming slightly more careful but not fundamentally changing their prescribing patterns. The pharmaceutical companies accepted Schedule II status because it still allowed them to manufacture and sell billions of pills. They just had to track them better. What actually changed was that prescription restrictions created black market opportunity. If doctors became reluctant to prescribe what people wanted or needed, someone else would supply it. The legal restrictions didn't eliminate demand, they just redirected it toward illegal sources. Which meant that people who'd developed dependencies on prescription amphetamines sometimes turned to street sources when their scripts dried up. The housewife who'd been on prescribed digoxin for 5 years and whose doctor suddenly got cautious about renewal didn't stop wanting or needing the drug. She either found a new doctor, suffered through withdrawal, or found alternative sources. The system had created dependencies and was now making those dependencies harder to manage legally, which is how you create black markets. By the mid-1970s, prescription amphetamine use was declining from its peak, but remained significant. The casual diet pills for everyone era was ending, but stimulants were still prescribed for various conditions where use could be medically justified. The medical establishment had learned to be more careful about obvious overprescribing, but the fundamental acceptance of stimulants as appropriate medical tools persisted. Street methamphetamine use was quietly increasing during this period, though it remained relatively contained geographically, mostly western states, particularly California. The manufacturing knowledge was spreading, helped by counterculture chemistry texts with titles that suggested revolutionary politics, but really just taught drug synthesis. Biker gangs expanded their production. The infrastructure for a larger epidemic was being built. It just hadn't fully materialized yet. The late 1970s brought cocaine into fashion, which is relevant because cocaine normalized stimulant use among middle and upper classes. Disco culture embraced coke as glamorous and sophisticated, which is hilarious in retrospect but seemed plausible at the time. Cocaine had cachet that methamphetamine lacked, but they served similar functions: energy, confidence, enhanced socializing. The cocaine boom made stimulants seem less foreign, more acceptable, which would matter later. By 1980, methamphetamine had reached an interesting place in American culture. The prescription era was waning. Street distribution was established, but not yet epidemic. The drug existed in a strange middle space, no longer quite mainstream, but not yet the crisis it would become. What nobody fully appreciated was how dramatically things were about to change. The 1980s would bring new synthesis methods, new distribution networks, and new populations of users. Rural America, economically devastated, was about to discover methamphetamine in ways that would fundamentally alter entire communities. The prescription era had taught millions of Americans what stimulants could do. It had normalized the idea that exhaustion and life's demands could be chemically managed. The cultural foundation mattered enormously when methamphetamine production moved from pharmaceutical companies to basement labs, and when the drug spread into areas that had never dealt with it before. The housewife on prescribed disoxin in 1965 and the rural meth user in 1995 were separated by decades and context, but they were using fundamentally the same chemical to address fundamentally similar problems: exhaustion, despair, feeling like life's demands exceeded their capacity to meet them without chemical assistance. America had spent 20 years normalizing stimulant use through medical channels, teaching people that these drugs were solutions rather than problems, and now that knowledge was about to spread beyond medical control into communities that were desperate enough to try anything that might make the pain stop. The next chapter was going to make the prescription era look almost quaint by comparison, because at least prescription methamphetamine came with medical oversight, dosing information, and some semblance of quality control. What was coming had none of that, just the drug, increasingly pure, increasingly available, spreading through American communities like a chemical wildfire that nobody knew how to extinguish. But that's a story for the next section. For now, let's just acknowledge that America looked at Nazi Germany's Powhatan disaster, said, "We can do better," spent 20 years prescribing methamphetamine to housewives and truckers, and somehow seemed surprised when things got worse instead of better. Humans are really bad at learning from other people's mistakes, turns out. We prefer to make them ourselves, just with better marketing. So we've watched methamphetamine go from Japanese lab curiosity to Nazi war fuel to American housewife helper. You'd think that's enough chaos for one drug. You'd think humanity might have learned something. You would be adorably optimistic and completely wrong. Because the 1980s arrived like a terrible sequel nobody asked for, bringing with it the next evolution of methamphetamine's story. And this chapter makes the prescription era look almost quaint by comparison. We're about to watch a pharmaceutical compound become a cottage industry, then an epidemic, then a full-blown crisis that would devastate rural America in ways that are still unfolding today. The 1970s had ended with methamphetamine in a strange place. Prescription use was declining but not gone. Street use existed but was relatively contained, mostly West Coast, mostly biker gangs and specific subcultures. The drug was present but manageable, like a small fire that seemed under control. And then someone figured out you could make methamphetamine in a kitchen. The 1980s brought something that changed everything. The the recipe went public. Not through some official pharmaceutical leak or government conspiracy. Nothing that organised. It spread through counterculture publications, through word of mouth, through a book that would become infamous in drug history circles. A chemist writing under the pseudonym Uncle Fester published synthesis guides that made methamphetamine production accessible to anyone with basic chemistry knowledge and access to a hardware store. The books had titles that suggested revolutionary politics, but were really just detailed instructions for making drugs in your basement. Secrets of Methamphetamine Manufacture became the cookbook that launched 1,000 disasters. The genius, and I use that word with maximum bitterness, of these synthesis methods was that they used readily available precursor chemicals, particularly pseudoephedrine, which is the active ingredient in common cold medicines like Sudafed. Suddenly, the key ingredient for making meth was sitting on pharmacy shelves, available without prescription, cheap and plentiful. Pseudoephedrine is structurally similar to methamphetamine. Remember Nagai's original work-reducing ephedrine? Same principle, slightly different starting point. With the right chemicals and process, you could convert cold medicine into meth in a process that sounds simple in description and is absolutely catastrophic in practice. Because here's the thing about DIY methamphetamine production. It's not like baking cookies. The chemicals involved are toxic, volatile, and enthusiastically flammable. The synthesis produces toxic waste. The process can explode if you make mistakes, which amateur chemists do frequently, because they learn it from photocopied instructions rather than actual chemistry education. But despite the obvious dangers, or perhaps because people are phenomenally bad at risk assessment when money's involved, amateur meth production took off like a chemical wildfire through rural America, and this is where we need to talk about why it took off specifically in rural communities, because that geography isn't coincidental. Rural America in the 1980s was experiencing economic devastation that's hard to overstate if you didn't live through it. The farm crisis of the 1980s destroyed rural economies across the Midwest and South. Family farms that had existed for generations went bankrupt. Agricultural prices collapsed. Small towns that had been built around farming economies suddenly had no economic foundation. Young people left for cities because there was no work. The people who stayed faced unemployment, poverty, and the slow death of their communities. Into this economic despair came methamphetamine, offering two things that desperate people need: an escape from pain and a way to make money. Rural areas were perfect for meth production in practical ways that had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with logistics. Isolated properties where neighbours were far away and unlikely to notice suspicious activity. Cheap real estate, abandoned farms, trailer homes in the middle of nowhere, limited law enforcement presence because rural counties couldn't afford large police forces. The setup costs were relatively low. The ingredients were available at multiple stores to avoid suspicion. The production process took hours, not days, and the profit margin was extraordinary because you were converting $50 of cold medicine and chemicals into product worth thousands. For someone facing unemployment, mounting debt, and no legitimate economic opportunities, the math was compelling even when the risks were obvious. It's not that people didn't know meth production was dangerous and illegal, it's that the alternative, watching your family lose everything, seemed worse. This is where the story gets dark in ways that require careful handling, because we're talking about real human suffering driven by systemic economic failure. The people who started cooking meth in rural America weren't cartoon villains. They were desperate people making terrible choices in impossible situations, and the consequences would devastate entire communities. The trailer park meth lab became an archetype for good reason. Mobile homes were cheap, isolated, and if one exploded, the property loss was relatively contained. But that makes it sound almost manageable. which misses the human reality of what was happening. These were small-scale operations, at least initially. Someone would set up in their kitchen or bathroom, following instructions from photocopied pages, mixing chemicals and glassware bought from hardware stores. The process produced toxic fumes that permeated living spaces. Children were often present in homes where meth was being cooked, breathing toxic air, exposed to dangerous chemicals, living in environments that were literally poisonous. The explosions were frequent enough to become a recognised category of emergency response. Fire departments in rural areas started seeing a new pattern: structure fires with unusual chemical signatures, often in mobile homes, often with occupants who'd suffered chemical burns in addition to fire injuries. The explosions happened because the synthesis involves volatile chemicals and heat, and mistakes cause reactions that go from controlled to catastrophic in seconds. Police started recognising the signs of meth labs: unusual chemical smells, lots of cold medicine packages in trash, people buying large quantities of specific items like mason jars, coffee filters, and drain cleaner. But recognition didn't mean they could stop it, because there weren't enough police to monitor every isolated property encounters that covered hundreds of square miles, and the environmental damage was staggering. For every pound of methamphetamine produced, the synthesis generates 5 to 6 pounds of toxic waste. This waste contains heavy metals, acids, solvents, and other chemicals that are environmental hazards, and people were dumping it wherever was convenient: down drains, into septic systems, in forests, in fields, into streams. Properties where meth had been produced became contaminated in ways that were expensive to remediate and sometimes impossible to fully clean. The chemicals soak into walls, floors, carpets. They create health hazards that persist long after the lab is shut down. Some properties had to be condemned entirely because the contamination was too severe. But the environmental and property damage, severe as it was, paled compared to the human cost. The physical toll of methamphetamine use became impossible to ignore. Where prescription amphetamines had created problems that were somewhat hidden, street meth's effects were written on users' bodies in ways that shocked even experienced medical professionals. Meth mouth became a recognised phenomenon, severe tooth decay that happened rapidly and dramatically. Methamphetamine causes dry mouth by reducing saliva production. Saliva protects teeth, so without it, decay accelerates. Users also grind their teeth, crave sugary drinks, and often neglect dental hygiene. The combination creates catastrophic dental destruction, sometimes resulting in total tooth loss within months of regular use. Dentists started seeing patients in their 20s with mouths that looked like they belonged to people in their 70s, teeth rotted, broken, or missing entirely. The visual impact was shocking and served as one of the most visible warnings about meth's effects. The skin problems were equally disturbing. Methamphetamine causes intense itching, partly from the drug's effects on nerve endings, partly from the feeling that bugs are crawling under your skin, a hallucination called formication. Users scratch obsessively, creating sores that don't heal properly because meth impairs the body's healing processes. These sores get infected, leave permanent scars, and create visible markers of addiction. The weight loss was dramatic and unhealthy. Methamphetamine suppresses appetite completely, and users often go days without eating. Combined with the drug's metabolic effects, this creates rapid weight loss that leaves people looking skeletal. The visual transformation from healthy person to gaunt meth user could happen in months. The aging acceleration was startling. Methamphetamine's effects on skin, teeth, and overall health made users look decades older than their actual age. Photos showing the progression of meth use over time became tools for prevention education because the visual deterioration was undeniable and horrifying. The neurological damage was less visible but more permanent. Methamphetamine is neurotoxic. It literally damages brain cells, particularly in areas involved in memory, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Long-term users showed cognitive impairment that persisted even after stopping use. Memory problems, difficulty concentrating, emotional regulation issues. The drug was changing brain structure in ways that might never fully reverse. The cardiovascular effects were severe and sometimes fatal. Methamphetamine dramatically increases heart rate and blood pressure. Chronic use causes damage to blood vessels and heart tissue. Young people were having strokes and heart attacks. Their cardiovascular systems aged by years of stimulant abuse. Emergency rooms in rural areas started seeing meth-related admissions with increasing frequency. Overdoses, psychotic breaks, cardiovascular emergencies, injuries from accidents that happened while users were impaired. Rural hospitals, already stretched thin by limited resources, were overwhelmed by a new category of medical crisis. And the psychological effects created their own category of horror. Methamphetamine-induced psychosis became a recognized phenomenon that even experienced psychiatric professionals found disturbing. Users would experience paranoid delusions, often believing they were being watched, followed, or persecuted. Visual and auditory hallucinations, extreme agitation and aggression. Some users would stay awake for weeks, and the sleep deprivation combined with drug effects created breaks from reality that were severe and sometimes violent. There are documented cases of users becoming convinced that family members were trying to harm them, that the government was monitoring their thoughts, that people were breaking into their homes. The paranoia was so intense that users would barricade themselves in rooms, weapons nearby, genuinely believing they were defending against threats that didn't exist. The treatment challenges were enormous. Methamphetamine withdrawal, while not as physically dangerous as alcohol or opiate withdrawal, was psychologically devastating. The depression was profound. Users felt incapable of experiencing pleasure without the drug because meth had hijacked their dopamine systems so completely. The fatigue was overwhelming. Many users described feeling like they'd never be happy or energetic again without meth. And they were partially right, at least for a while. The brain's recovery from methamphetamine use takes months to years. The dopamine system has to heal. Neural pathways have to rebuild. During that recovery period, users face depression, anhedonia, inability to feel pleasure, and fatigue that make every day feel impossible. The relapse rates were crushing. Users would get clean, suffer through weeks or months of feeling terrible, then use again because the temporary relief seemed worth it. The cycle of use, consequences, attempted recovery, and relapse ground people down in ways that destroyed lives over years. But individual addiction, as devastating as it was, existed within a larger pattern of family and community destruction. Children in homes where parents used meth faced neglect that ranged from benign inattention to life-threatening danger. Parents on meth often became obsessed with the drug, to the exclusion of everything else, including their children's basic needs. Kids went hungry because parents forgot to feed them or had no food in the house. They went to school dirty because hygiene wasn't a priority when you're tweaking. They lived in dangerous conditions, homes with exposed chemicals, unsecured weapons, unstable adults. And in homes where meth was being produced, children were exposed to toxic chemicals that affected their development. There are cases of children testing positive for meth exposure just from living in contaminated homes. The long-term health effects of that exposure are still being studied. The foster care system in rural states became overwhelmed. Social workers were removing children from homes at rates that exceeded the system's capacity to place them. Foster families were scarce because rural areas had limited options. Kids ended up in group homes or bouncing between placements, experiencing trauma on top of trauma, and the generational patterns were heartbreaking. Children who grew up in meth-affected homes were at higher risk of eventually using meth themselves. They'd witnessed addiction, experienced trauma, often had inadequate education and limited opportunities. The drug that had destroyed their parents' lives became a risk factor for their own futures. The community-level effects were equally devastating. Small towns watched themselves hollowed out by addiction. Property values collapsed in areas known for meth problems. Businesses closed because crime increased and customers stayed away. Schools struggled with students dealing with parental addiction and home instability. The crime associated with meth, theft to fund habits, violence during psychotic episodes, the danger of meth production itself, made communities feel unsafe in ways they'd never experienced. Rural areas that had traditionally been places where people didn't lock doors suddenly had residents installing security systems and avoiding certain areas. Law enforcement faced impossible challenges. Rural police departments and sheriff's offices were understaffed and underfunded. They couldn't be everywhere, couldn't stop every lab, couldn't arrest their way out of a problem that was fundamentally about economic despair and addiction rather than criminality. And when they did make arrests, the criminal justice system was overwhelmed. Jails filled with meth-related offenders. Court systems backed up. The costs of prosecution and incarceration drained county budgets that were already struggling. Some law enforcement officers described it as trying to bail out a sinking boat with a teaspoon. They'd shut down a lab, arrest the operators, and 3 more labs would pop up in different locations. The problem was systemic, not individual, but the tools available were designed for individual enforcement. The environmental contamination affected entire communities. Lab sites contaminated soil and water. Rural areas often rely on well water, and chemical contamination from meth production could affect neighbours' water supplies. Some areas had so many former lab sites that systematic environmental remediation was financially impossible. This is the part of the story where everything gets darker, because into this chaos of small-scale production and community devastation came organised crime, and the problem that had been terrible became catastrophic. Mexican drug cartels had been watching the American meth market develop with professional interest. They saw growing demand, high prices, and a market dominated by amateur producers making inconsistent product in dangerous conditions. They saw opportunity. Cartels had infrastructure, expertise, and resources that amateur cooks couldn't match. They could build actual laboratories, not kitchen operations, but facilities designed for chemical production. They had access to precursor chemicals in bulk. They had distribution networks established from marijuana and cocaine trafficking. And they had chemists who actually knew what they were doing, who could produce methamphetamine with purity levels far exceeding anything from trailer park labs. The super labs that cartels built, mostly in Mexico but some in the US, changed the market fundamentally. These weren't amateur operations. They were industrial-scale facilities producing hundreds of pounds of meth per production cycle. The efficiency and output were on a completely different scale than anything that had come before. The purity levels were higher, often 90% or above, compared to 40-60% for many small-scale operations. Higher purity meant more potent effects, which users wanted but which also increased addiction potential and health risks. And cartels could produce it cheaper than small operations because of their scale and efficiency. The price of meth actually decreased as cartels took over production, which meant it became more accessible to more people. Economic logic combined with addiction to expand the market. The distribution networks cartels established were sophisticated. They moved product across borders using methods developed over decades of drug trafficking. Hidden compartments in vehicles, tunnels, corrupt officials, diversification, across multiple routes to minimize interdiction risk. Once in the US, the distribution fanned out through networks that reached into rural communities that had never been on cartels' radar before. Small-town dealers who'd previously gotten meth from local producers now had access to cheaper, more potent product from cartel sources. The violence associated with cartel operations was different from anything rural America had experienced. Cartels operated with ruthless efficiency, eliminating competition, enforcing territory, using violence as business strategy. The cartel violence mostly stayed in Mexico and border regions, but the ripples affected distribution networks throughout the US. For users, the cartel takeover of production meant more available, cheaper, purer meth, which sounds like market success, but translated to more addiction, more overdoses, more lives destroyed. The small-scale cooks who dominated the market in the 1990s and early 2000s couldn't compete. Some got out of production entirely. Others became distribution points for cartel product rather than manufacturers. The cottage industry was being replaced by industrial-scale production, and the consequences would be measured in waves of addiction that dwarfed what had come before. But wait. As they say in infomercials promising terrible products, there's more. Because just as cartel meth was flooding the market, another crisis was developing that would intersect with methamphetamine in devastating ways. The opioid epidemic had been building through the 2000s and exploded in the 2010s. Prescription painkillers had created millions of addicted people, many of whom eventually switched to heroin when prescriptions became harder to get. And then fentanyl entered the heroin supply, causing overdose deaths to skyrocket. Methamphetamine and opioids found each other, and the combination was catastrophic. The drug use pattern that developed was people using opioids to get high, then using methamphetamine to function, to avoid nodding off completely, to maintain some capacity for activity, or using meth to get high, then using opioids to come down, to sleep, to manage the anxiety and crash from stimulants. This polydrug use created new patterns of addiction that were harder to treat than either drug alone. Users were dependent on multiple substances with different mechanisms of action, different withdrawal patterns, different risks. And then, because apparently the situation needed to get worse, fentanyl started appearing in methamphetamine. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that's roughly 50 times more potent than heroin. It's deadly in tiny amounts, and it started appearing in drugs where users didn't expect it, including methamphetamine. Sometimes intentionally mixed, sometimes as cross-contamination from dealers handling multiple substances, sometimes as deliberate adulteration by suppliers. Users who thought they were using only methamphetamine were exposed to fentanyl without knowing it. And because they weren't expecting opioids, they didn't have naloxone available, which is the reversal agent for opioid overdoses. The result was overdose deaths from methamphetamine that were actually fentanyl poisoning. Medical examiners started seeing deaths classified as stimulant overdoses that showed opioid involvement. The drug supply had become so contaminated and unpredictable that users couldn't know what they were actually consuming. Harm reduction efforts tried to address this with fentanyl test strips, which could detect fentanyl presence in drugs before use. But distribution of test strips was limited, and many users didn't have access or didn't use them consistently. The addiction treatment system, already overwhelmed by the opioid crisis, now face people addicted to multiple substances simultaneously. Treatment protocols designed for single drug addiction weren't adequate. The medical complexity of managing someone withdrawing from both stimulants and opioids while maintaining stability was challenging even in well-resourced facilities, and most rural areas didn't have well-resourced facilities. They often didn't have facilities at all. Treatment access in rural America was sparse at best. People might have to travel hundreds of miles to find treatment programs with availability. Many programs had waiting lists measured in months. The lack of treatment infrastructure meant that even people who wanted help often couldn't access it. They'd reach out for treatment and be told there were no beds available, no appointments for weeks or months, no programs within reasonable distance. So they'd try to quit on their own, which for methamphetamine usually meant suffering through weeks of depression and exhaustion without medical support. The success rate for unsupported self-detox was predictably low. Most people relapsed, often multiple times, sometimes giving up on recovery entirely after repeated failures. The criminal justice system became the default response because treatment wasn't available. People got arrested for possession or related crimes, spent time in jail, then were released back to the same communities and circumstances that had contributed to their addiction in the first place. Recidivism rates were high because incarceration without treatment doesn't address addiction. Some areas tried drug courts, which diverted people from jail to treatment programs. These showed better outcomes than pure incarceration, but they required treatment programs to exist, and many rural areas still lacked adequate facilities. By the 2010s, the methamphetamine situation in rural America had become a full-blown crisis that was intersecting with the opioid epidemic to create a perfect storm of addiction and death. The statistics were grim and getting worse. Methamphetamine-related overdose deaths increased dramatically. Some of this was pure meth overdose, the drug's cardiovascular effects causing heart attacks or strokes. Some was fentanyl contamination. Some was the combined effects of polydrug use creating lethal interactions. Emergency room visits for meth-related issues increased. Psychotic breaks, cardiovascular emergencies, accidents while impaired, complications from injection drug use. Rural hospitals saw increasing numbers of patients presenting with meth-related medical crises. Child welfare systems remained overwhelmed. The number of children in foster care due to parental drug use continued to climb. Social workers faced impossible caseloads. Foster families were scarce. The system was breaking under pressure it wasn't designed to handle. Incarceration rates for meth-related offences were high, but incarceration wasn't reducing use or availability. It was just cycling people through the system at enormous cost without addressing the underlying addiction or the economic and social factors that made drug use appealing. The economic cost was staggering when you added up medical care, law enforcement, incarceration, lost productivity, child welfare, and all the other direct and indirect expenses. Some estimates put the total cost in the billions annually, money that wasn't being spent on treatment or prevention, or addressing the economic despair that made drugs attractive in the first place. And throughout all of this, the human suffering was immense and often invisible. Families destroyed by addiction, parents losing custody of children, children growing up with trauma and instability, people dying from overdoses, from drug-related violence, from the accumulated health effects of years of use, communities watching themselves decline with no clear path to recovery. The meth epidemic didn't happen in isolation. It was intertwined with economic collapse, the opioid crisis, failures of the healthcare system, inadequacies of addiction treatment, and criminal justice responses that didn't address root causes. Each crisis amplified the others in a system that seemed designed to fail the people it was supposed to help. By 2020, methamphetamine use had reached levels that exceeded even the peak of the prescription era. More people were using, the drug was more available and cheaper than ever, the purity was higher, and the death toll was climbing. The geographic pattern had expanded beyond rural areas. Urban centres that had previously seen relatively little meth use started reporting increases. The drug that had been associated with rural poverty was becoming more universal, affecting diverse populations across different regions. The demographic pattern was also shifting. What had been primarily a white rural phenomenon was affecting Hispanic populations, African American communities, LGBTQ+ populations in urban areas. The drug crossed demographic boundaries more than many substances, and the methods of use were evolving. Smoking remained common, but injection drug use was increasing, which brought additional risks: HIV, hepatitis, bacterial infections, all the complications associated with needle sharing and unsafe injection practices. The COVID-19 pandemic made everything worse, as if the situation needed additional complications. Isolation increased drug use. Treatment programs shut down or reduced capacity. Economic stress from pandemic-related job losses created more desperation. The overdose rate spiked during pandemic years as people used alone, as the drug supply became more contaminated, as support systems collapsed. This is the current state of methamphetamine in America as of 2025, a crisis that's been building for decades, that's intersecting with other drug crises, that's overwhelming response systems, and that's showing no signs of improvement without fundamental changes in approach. The story so far has been about how we got here, from Japanese laboratories to Nazi Germany to American Housewives to rural meth labs to cartel super labs to the current crisis. It's a century of making the same mistakes repeatedly, of choosing short-term solutions over long-term planning, of treating addiction as a moral failure rather than medical condition, of failing to address the economic and social conditions that make drug use attractive. And the question that sits at the end of this section isn't, why did this happen? We know why. Economic despair, pharmaceutical enthusiasm, insufficient regulation, addiction mechanics, human desire for escape from suffering, systemic failures across multiple institutions. The question is, what do we do now? Because the current approach clearly isn't working. We've tried incarceration. It doesn't reduce use or availability. We've tried interdiction. Cartels adapt faster than law enforcement. We've tried just say no. It fails because addiction isn't a choice made by rational decision-making. The evidence from other countries, from pilot programs in the US, from decades of research, all points towards certain conclusions about what actually helps. But implementing those conclusions requires political will, funding, and admitting that we've been doing things wrong for a very long time. That's the next section. What the science tells us about addiction, what actually works in treatment and prevention, what systemic changes would address root causes rather than symptoms, and what cautious hope looks like in the face of a crisis that's been building for a century. Because this story doesn't end here. In the darkness of rural America's meth crisis and the intersection with the opioid epidemic, there are paths forward. They're difficult paths that require honesty, resources, and fundamental changes in how we think about drugs, addiction, and the social conditions that create vulnerability. But first we had to understand how we got here, to see the full picture of methamphetamine's journey from pharmaceutical curiosity to crisis. Now we know. And knowing, as they say, is supposed to be half the battle. The other half is figuring out what to actually do about it. And that's where things get complicated, because the solutions that work are often politically difficult, expensive in the short term, and require admitting that decades of policy have been fundamentally wrong. But we'll get to that. First, let's sit with the reality of where we are. A country dealing with a drug crisis that's killed hundreds of thousands of people, destroyed countless families and communities, and shows no signs of stopping without dramatic intervention. The numbers are grim, the human stories are heartbreaking, and the path forward is unclear. but at least now we understand the history, the mechanisms, the systemic failures that created this situation. And understanding, however dark the picture it reveals, is the necessary first step toward doing better.